opportunity to meet with the RPF, and were among the first supporters of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, as well as Paul Kagame, the defense minister and vice president of Rwanda. And in 1987, we had an opportunity to be one of the first to introduce President Yoweri Museveni to the Harlem community in October of that year to promote the ideas of the national resistance movement and army. So therefore, when the uprising took place in October 1996 in Goma and Uvira and Bukavu in eastern Congo, we, of course, who have been supporting of the national liberation movement in the Congo for all these years, were glad that it took place. And we knew that there were certain contradictions with the Rwandan connection to the military operations and training programs in the United States, i.e. the JCET, the Joint Combined Exchange Training Program, IMET, the International Military Education Program, and REACT, the Rwandan Interagency Training Program. But giving the people the best of the logic that they knew what they were actually doing, we had to keep our eye on that. And of course, there were many other groups that felt that this was a major contradiction. But our assessment of the major contradiction was to get rid of Mobutu and to rebuild the Congo. We also were very familiar with the history of the armed struggle in the Congo. So therefore, when the name Laurent Kabila first appeared in the paper, we were very much glad to see that, because that was the person we knew to be a genuine humanist. We had an opportunity to do the first interview with him on May 12th last year by radio or by phone from BAI, and then from there subsequently went to the June 30th anniversary, where we had an opportunity to meet with various people, including Minister Mwanaponga, who is now the agriculture minister. He was the finance minister at the time, and we had kept his voice out here as a voice of the revolution when the ADFL was first fighting, from October of 1996 until these very days when we still maintain him on air. We still try to talk to him because we know him, we trust him, and we have to have the same assessment of the situation. Same thing with Menzi Congo, the justice minister. So therefore, those are our subjective biases, if you can call it that. It's based on the reality that we have experienced with them. And of course, I did an hour interview with President Laurent Kabila on July the 4th last year, which within that conversation, many of the problems that we're talking about today were, discussed. But we didn't know to what extent we were discussing it, because we were just going through an overview of what these things were supposed to mean in the overall scheme of things. So I'm not going to go into the detail of those right now. I want to try to get two guest speakers. One, brother who I know for years, going back to at least 1975, when we struggled around the issue of Angola. That's Dr. James Garrett. And of course, Sala Brooker, who is a fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations, who we have been discussing the situation on the WBAI for quite some time.
During the month of July and into the early part of August, I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a result of an invitation by the government of the DRC. I was invited to attempt to do some assessment work, which I've done off and on for 25 or 30 years in both Africa and Asia, with the prospect of trying to find ways that African Americans and Africans in the diaspora could contribute to the reconstruction and development of the Congo. At various times in history, particularly Africans in the diaspora, African Americans, etc., have been provided opportunities to engage in this kind of activity. It happened with Nkrumah during the 1950s and 60s. It happened again with Nyerere, and there have been other times that it's happened in the in the Caribbean, in South America, like in Guyana, in the early days of the attempt to build a cooperative republic. And this was an opportunity that some of us were asked to participate in. And that's the basis on which I went to the Congo. And I've already spoken in other settings about what I had seen. But I mentioned just a couple of things. Just in terms of the lives of the people, since we raised this question of Mobutuism without Mobutu, just a couple of points. The first is a visit to the market in Kinshasa and other places where at each point the market women, and some of you who are from Africa, have been to Africa, know that the day-to-day life, the commercial life of many of the nations on the African continent are dominated by the women. The women in the market. That's who runs men do the talk, as the sister said, and women do the work. Well, the women were saying constantly they could hold their money in their hands. Now, for us, it doesn't mean very much. Of course, if you live in New York City, it means a lot. But it may not mean very much except when you think about what they said is that the boys couldn't strip their money from them. That is, under Mobutu, if the market women held their new francs or their zaires in their hands, the boys, meaning the soldiers, who were themselves not properly paid by Mobutu, would strip the money from them. Now, again, that may not mean very much in terms of the global issues, but it means a great deal to the day-to-day economic life in the Congo, because those people, those women, conduct that economic life. They run it. They control it. They didn't have to have their money. They didn't have to put it on the side. They didn't have to worry about extortion. They were free to act. And so, as they said, Kabila is a good boy. The second was when we came into the country the first night. I've traveled all over Africa, spent a lot of time in Africa, lived on the African continent and in Asia. Two things. One is young men weren't hanging around the airport. Some of you have been into Okoye Airport. Do you know what I'm talking about, Okoye? In Nigeria. You come into the airport, you have to fight your way through the airport. I'm not trying to attack Nigeria now. What I'm trying to do is tell you what I've seen. They weren't hanging around. In fact, wherever I went, I didn't see young men hanging out in large groups, just standing. Well, again, that doesn't mean much globally, but it means something in terms of what is happening to young people. They're in school, they're in military, they're in national service, they're involved in the development of the nation. The third thing that I saw, was groups of young women walking the streets at night in Kinshasa. Now, many of us had heard stories about the army, Mobutu's government people rounding young women up, taking them away, raping them, and dropping them off. Those little things speak a great deal to me, because that is the part of civil society that in many cases aren't spoken to. Youth, young women, and the market women. That sector of civil society, which defines society in very clear ways, and we know it does so in urban sectors and black communities in this country. Safety, the ability to carry on business, the ability to live their lives. Taught me a great deal. And that was before I met with anybody from either side.
Let me just say briefly that I think the danger of the destructive potential of this conflict is too often underestimated. This is very much, in many ways, could represent the first African World War. We already have 5 countries involved in this conflict, 5 sovereign African countries. There's no direct non-African intervention that we're aware of to date.
Yeah, I see the DRC activity as a watershed event. In fact, I, at some levels, agree with Brother Booker that the fact that there are, as I understand it, 6 African nations, including the indigenous nation, plus 3 European nations involved in that war, The U.S., France, and Britain are deeply involved in that war, and certainly Kagame, who has his linkages to Israel, is deeply involved in support levels of that war. So that I think that to shape this notion as if it is like narrow conflict happening inside a few kind of like opportunistic people here and there, and maybe everybody's got the same level of, no. This is global capitalism at work. It's just dripping down, distillating, falling down on itself, right? I mean, it's so terrible that we are expected to see the United States as a moral compass that we should follow. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. A body of people who have been raped and pillaged. We are pariahs inside our own this country, right? And we're going to accept the U.S. as a moral compass, a narrow body of activity to which the U.S. isn't even mentioned. The United States, which is right now training the defense forces in Uganda today, engaged in doing it in Uganda today, and the French, who supported the destruction of the Tutsi people by certain reactionaries among the Hutus, now training the administration inside the Rwanda government. What are we talking about here?
On the economic front, the government of Laurent Kabila turned off investors and donors alike with his indecisiveness. And there was no significant momentum over the past year in the economic reconstruction of the country, either in terms of investment or in terms of development cooperation for reconstruction. I'm not suggesting that the fault was all his personally and that no responsibility exists on the part of the donor community. But nevertheless, his government's leadership failed to address the pressing economic issues facing 45 million Congolese.
There's some notion that when we talk about the idea that Kabila, as some kind of individual force, is turning off donors and investors. Okay, who are the donors? The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Right? Let's go to Russia and ask them, hey, look, man, should we have turned you out? Yeah, man, we're here to turn you out quick. You know, we're dying right now behind inviting you in. Right? Who are the investors? We're talking about the World Trade Organization. We're talking about the G7 and its little buddy, Russia, right? Which is now like some kind of weird aberrant G8. It's number 8, but it's kind of like not even there, it just has to be there for maybe the future. But the notion that let's name these forces. I mean, this is a watershed moment both for activists and progressives and thinkers in this country, because what we're talking about is the richest nation on the planet. 40% the size of the United States. 47 million African people, raped and pillaged by Belgium, followed by France, right? Installed, there is no Mobutu, talking about Mobutuism, there's no Mobutu without the United States CIA. They created him. So the interesting, I heard a very interesting thing about Kabila. I heard him called a throwback. He was a throwback because A, he nationalized a diamond mine. I have a paper right here by Horace Campbell, professor at Syracuse University, denouncing Kabila for being repressive. He nationalized a diamond mine, and his other act of repression was that he said, look, we're going to stabilize the currency because we have an inflation rate of 1,000% a month. We're going to cut it 1-to-1 to the dollar. We're going to stabilize the economy, and that's how it's going to be. I mean, didn't we support that when Fidel did it back in 1959? I mean, when did it become a throwback, right? When did it become a negative act to say, no, we're not going to have you selling currency. We're not going to have you counterfeiting currency. We're not going to have that. Well, we think that's positive repression because what he's done is incredibly, is that all of the currency is active. You can transfer the currency, you can work it out, and there's very, very low inflation. Well, that means that if he hasn't done anything developmental for the country, and he stabilized the currency, isn't that a little contradiction there? I mean, his currency is better off than the one in the United States, in Japan, and certainly in Russia.
Kabila adopted something very similar to Mobutu's style of personal rule. He did not reach out to nonviolent political opponents of Mobutu Sese Seko. He did not embrace the pre-existing democratic forces that existed in Zaire that had been struggling to unseat Mobutu for years. And instead, he alienated not only these democratic forces in the country, but his own early allies, the Congolese from the east, Banyamulenge in particular, but also Rwanda, Uganda, and to some extent the Angolan government as well. He was increasingly relying on relatives in important positions of power in government, and according to many credible reports, he was increasingly creating an armed forces that was going to rely much more on what one might refer to as homeboys, people from his own home region of the Congo. And he was seeking, in that extent, to reconstruct a national army very much as his own personal guard. Again, pursuing a style of political leadership very similar to that of Mobutu Sese Seko.
He's also repressive in that he hasn't had elections. He's been in office 15 months. I read the document that Horace Campbell put forth says that, why hasn't he had elections? Well, and the person he holds up is a friend, a person who was close, I was close to, and one of my students, Museveni, who didn't have elections for what, 10, 12, 13 years? So, I mean, look at this. We haven't had, I mean, look at the first block of time in this country, the elections were a joke until 1840 in this country. Like for 50 years they were a joke. So when we talk about this stuff, we are holding Kabila up to a standard that not only has nobody else met, but we ourselves, well, maybe we ourselves could have done it in 6 months. That's what I'm going to tell ours. If he were the president of Congo, and he took on a country where Mobutu and his folks had stolen the entire treasury of the country. So when they say he's corrupt, there isn't anything to steal. The people live Spartan lives, and the president lives a Spartan life, and is not comfortable in the city. Lives a very Spartan life. So so what we do is we will make a term. Oh, he's Mobutuist, in much the same way as we used to talk. You know, they were talking about wolves in New York. They were calling people wolfing, and they put a term to you, and that term doesn't require a definition. You then move with that term as if it is a truth, but you don't look to the analysis, right? What about Kabila's government is corrupt? Is it poor? They run the country by cell phone. There's no telecommunications. Did he create that? The United States, Britain, France? I haven't heard anybody damn the United States, Britain, France, Belgium for the conditions that exist in the Congo. No, they're the moral compass. Incredible. But for us, I think that we need to raise at least some things about what we can do. I mean, that's why I went to the Congo in the first place. I didn't know there was going to be a war. I know that there were Rwandan commanders in Goma and Bukavu. I know can't tell me anything different. But those things, now they have already admitted it. So we're not talking about people being on the border. We're talking about Ugandan troops saying that they are in the Congo, and Rwandan troops saying that they're there. So it doesn't do us any good to say that they weren't there anymore. That lie is already, even the people who did it don't project that lie anymore. So it doesn't do us any good to project it as the truth anymore. We need to find a new truth, even if that truth is a lie. First thing it seems to me is that it's important to affect immediate opinion in this country, that is the necessity to address some of the visible leadership. I think that it's incredible that unless Bill Clinton and the World Trade Organization take a stand, our leadership can't take a stand. That's absurd. The second thing, and that includes religious leaders, political leaders, community, people who claim to be, there's a big struggle between certain individuals over who is the leader of the African American tribe in Africa. Not one of them has made a public statement about this issue. Well, if you're the leader of the tribe, as Shaka Zulu said, if you can't lead, off with your head. The second thing is that there needs to be a tremendous amount of contact work. New York is the base for the discussion and debate that's going on around this issue in communities. It's very difficult to build at other places. So, again, New York is taking the lead. It's necessary to spread this through the internet. We've done surveys on the internet. Very few black internet servers have issues around the Congo, and we can address those questions. We have capacity, we have intellect, and we have access to the internet. We can address these issues. The other thing, and the reason I went there again, was we need to start working around preparing for reconstruction of the Congo. The Kabila government will win, but it is a devastated place. And we have people with tremendous skills that we can hone those skills, begin to figure out ways to work through them. I won't go through them tonight, but there'll be times when we'll address that. Included in that would be we have all these skills with a number of us, non-government organizations and foundations. The wife of the Minister of Justice, Mademoiselle Erica Lynn Wednesday, who's from Philadelphia, is in the audience. And she's a person who's trying to put together a program around foundations that address issues such as homelessness, such as, orphans. In many African languages, including Lingala, there's no word for orphans, so you have to reconstruct the whole language to address these questions. But there are a number of problems that need to be addressed. We visited the university in Kinshasa, and you want to know something that's horrible is a university where you have students who now feel safe to go to school, but have no, in the medical school and the law school, have no books. And we throw them away every year. There are all kinds of things that we can do. The last thing I want to say is that, I think Kabila is a Lumumbaist. He's a Lumumbaist of the first order. And we will come to recognize that as we open up the discussion. But the people of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the government of the DRC doesn't want to be at war with the United States. They want to make deals, they want to make business agreements, they want to make arrangements, they want to do all those things. The difference between what Kabila's raising and what some of the others are raising is that he wants to start his business deals not with the construction of wealth for a small group of people, but he wants to start all the deals raising the question, what's in it? How will it benefit the mass of the population that I'm trying to represent? Thank you very much.
I think that you've heard Brother Salah Booker and giving an assessment that I think reflects not only the line of the people who oppose Kabila, have, say, constructive or in some cases destructive criticism of Kabila, but it also represents, a position that most of the Western forces have. Now you know that Kabila was somebody they never wanted. If Nelson Mandela, a couple of months ago, told people, leave Kabila alone. He's doing a good job. I can show you in the paper. Nelson Mandela said this. He knows what he's doing, and should leave him alone. He's doing a good job. Thabo Mbeki, the deputy president of South Africa, warned Kabila about having a referendum later on this year to go to election next year because he said, you're not ready for elections. You don't have communications, you don't have a census. This is Thabo Mbeki. Now, forget the part that the United States took 13 years to get their own self an election. When they declared independence in 76, and they didn't have anything or even looking like an election until 1789. And from 1789 to 1917, the United States invaded, countries, over 133 countries. 133 times they invaded other countries. In other words, they did that before there was a Soviet Union. That's what 1789 to 1917. They found 133 excuses to interfere into other people's business before there was the so-called Russian or communist threat. What is Kabila? As Kabila said, because he was not only was he a person who was courageous as a youth, only 26 years old, in North Katanga, and Katanga being the most hostile province where Moise Chame and Godfrey Malungu, who ruled, and here he is a Lumumba's there.
I don't know how Laurent Kabila became the Messiah for many of you here in this audience.
First of all, I have to say with respect to a country's leader being viewed as a Messiah, that is very, very unfair and disingenuous. First of all, a country's leader, a head of state, embodies that country's policies, and that country's relationship to other nations. And Kabila is viewed as the head of state and analyzed in that context as Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and any other head of state. So to say that he is a Messiah because you place him in the same context as any other world leader is really, really disingenuous and really a false argument, which goes to my second point of these false arguments that have been advanced here tonight by our speaker who just left. I think it's really the heart of the matter in terms of the inherent contradictions, even from a common sense point of view. We know for the U.S. certainly to become so incensed about Ron Kabila with the 30 years of Mobutu in terms of what needs to be corrected in the country is just laughable and it's ridiculous. So there is no comparison there at all. Also, the fact that Kabila, the accusation was made that Kabila had done nothing. The fact that he went to other countries in Africa to get support, to iron out negotiations to deal with the civil strife in his country is an indication of not a personal commitment that he has to himself or his homeboys, which was even more ludicrous when you look at the magnitude and the seriousness of the situation, that it could be reduced to a homeboy ghetto kind of analysis, I think is really insulting to us. When the first speaker put forth the analysis that in fact Africa, the situation is so serious and of such a magnitude that it threatens to engulf the entire region, I think that is very serious. And that goes to the heart of, in my opinion, the counterinsurgency and intelligence that's being propagated by the West to destabilize Africa so that they can take control of the natural resources of the country.